have a Monday night lecture in the afternoon of Friday. So please help me to welcome our new visiting faculty member, Malcolm Woollen. I'd like to give some few notes on his background. This summer, when we were searching for a person to fill our fourth-year visiting position, among the criteria mentioned by the chairman of this department, Marvin Roseman, were we want to have a young person with an excellent background, various experiences, and the person who filled these qualifications is Malcolm Woollen from Indiana, from Indianapolis. He got his education at various parts of this country and abroad. He, during his high school years, did attend for a year Harrow School in the United Kingdom, which is a preparatory school, and he spent a year as a high school student in France as a school year abroad. He started to study at a very nice Middlebury College, a liberal arts college. Nice, not only because of its educational excellence, but I think because of the setting. Those people who have traveled through Vermont know if you live there, you establish a certain relationship to the environment. He received his Bachelor of Arts with honors in art history and continued his studies in architecture at Yale University, where he graduated in 1985. He worked, one of his first jobs was with David V. Scully. V stands for Vincent, and as a matter of fact, his father is the Vincent Scully from Yale University. There's one parallel between Malcolm and Daniel V. Scully. He also is a very famous architect. One of the best architects in Indiana is Evans Woollen, who happened to be the father of Malcolm Woollen. Malcolm also worked in his office for a short period of time, but more recently, since 1987, has worked for the firm of Venturi, Scott Brown, and Associates in Philadelphia. There he was associated with, mainly with working with Denise Brown, working on a variety of projects at, including large-scale projects. So his experience certainly encompasses international experiences, including, I should go back as far as college education is concerned, a one-year study abroad with the university, I'm sorry, not a 1 year, a one summer study abroad, one of our oldest study abroad programs in this country with the University of Illinois. Malcolm is talking about the cosmic house, which deals with, I think, some of the interests we have learned from his background. He's dealing with cross-cultural facets, drawing comparisons between Native American architecture and contemporary architecture. So without any further ado, help me to welcome Malcolm Woollen.
I fear a lot of you have come to learn about the work of Venturi Scott Brown, and I'm sorry to disappoint you. But if there are enough people interested, perhaps sometime in the future, I can talk at length about that. Could I have the lights, please? And the first slides. You all are probably familiar with the obsession in the 18th century and 19th century with prehistory. And generally, architects looked upon prehistory as an opportunity to in fact, legitimized their own theories about architecture. They did this in a somewhat abstract, intuitive way, with really no archaeological evidence, and generally with fairly little knowledge of what evidence did exist or was known at the time. Being interested in Native American forms and Central America, I've been intrigued with the idea of trying to look at Native American models and trying to derive certain notions, specifically notions around the house and how images of the house are sustained at several levels in Native American society. And then I thought that it could be interesting to look at American architectural history to see if we can find any clues. And in this process, I've focused on what I call the cosmic house. The term cosmic is more appropriate to a Native American context, but it does translate in a certain remote way to American history at the same time. And I hope to demonstrate that as this lecture progresses. Well, I'm beginning here with Central America, and on your left is a Mayan hut. On your right is a corbel vault of a more substantial Mayan building. You can see directly how the proportions of the hut have been transferred to the corbel vault. You see here it's rendered in timber, but the Mayan architects decided they really could not depart from this original formula, and they've rendered it in stone in their temples. On your left is a temple from Palenque in Mexico. On your right is Uxmal. And you can see how the same corbel vault derived from this original hut is transferred to more dignified, monumental public architecture. Both buildings extremely sophisticated, particularly the building on the right. When the actual mansard begins to be decorated as if it were a billboard. And I'd like to go into greater detail about Uxmal. I understand a number of students visited Uxmal during the field trip in the last few weeks. So carrying on, here we're dealing with Native America and the primary archetypal house that you find through the plains. And this is the Earth Lodge. And the Earth Lodge had great significance for the Plains Indians, and more than likely it derived, partly at least, from astronomical observations. And on your right is a medicine wheel found in Wyoming. And this is traced with smaller stones. And you can see, as the illustration indicates, the stones were laid out intentionally, at least so archaeologists think, to align with summer solstice and the various significant stars. Oops. You can see the same image of the Earth Lodge manifest in the Cheyenne camp circle, where teepees would be grouped in a gigantic circle. And although these Indians have adopted a more portable mode of living, the memory of the Earth Lodge remains. And I'd like to quote from an Olaga Sioux Indian, which would explain some of the sacred geometry of this site. Quote, "The Olaga believed the circle to be sacred because the Great Spirit caused everything in nature to be round except stone. Stone is the implement of destruction. The sun and the sky, the earth and the moon are round like a shield, though the sky is deep like a bowl. Everything that breathes is round like the body of a man. Everything that grows from the ground is round like the trunk of a tree. Since the Great Spirit has caused everything to be round, mankind should look upon the circle as sacred, for it is the symbol of all things in nature except stone. It is also the symbol that marks the edge of the world and therefore the four winds that travel there. Consequently, it is also the symbol of the year, the day, the night, and the moon go in a circle above the sky. Therefore, the circle is a symbol of these divisions of time and all time. For these reasons, the Oglala make their teepees circular, their camp circular, and sit in a circle at all ceremonies." You can see in Pueblo architecture how the memory of the Earth Lodge survives in a more sophisticated setting. And you can see that the idea of a unitary settlement still prevails. I guess to be most consistent, you would expect to see a Pueblo that's perfectly defined in a circle, a perfect circle. But you see the beginnings of what we would recognize as a Western building, in fact, where primary orientations, there is a primary orientation towards the sun. On your left is the Great Kiva at Chaco Canyon. And this Earth Lodge Kiva becomes the major temple. And the temples, you see several of them in each of these illustrations. And the temples were devoted to individual clans within the Kiva. But there's the social structure becomes very complex. And it's not my mission here to really go into that at great length. But it is still interesting that this civilization develops, but yet it maintains the memory of the prehistoric Earth Lodge. Not sure to keep it up. One of the primary fallacies at looking at Native American or, quote, primitive architecture is the fallacy of environmental determinism. And this is a primary instance of that fallacy. You have the Pueblo on your left and the Hogan on your right. And the Pueblo Indians and the Navajo lived very different lives, so although they occupied the same environment. And so this has become a classic example of in fact, what you might call the culturally determined aspect of architecture. This is an example closer to home. A number of you might have visited Anderson, and the great mound that you see right there. This was built by the Adena people probably as far back as 1000 BC. This is an Adena house. You can see in the same way the house form is echoed in the most sacred and ceremonial architecture. I'll draw your attention to this section to let you understand the plan a little better. Let's see if I can use this. You see the encircling ditch identified in the section there, and the embankments on both sides. And I really recommend a visit to this site. I really wasn't aware that there was prehistoric occupation of Indiana and Ohio until relatively recently. And I'll go on to describe more sophisticated examples of this. On your right is an absolutely enormous complex in Ohio. This is in Newark, Ohio, and it really inscribes 4 square miles. And not all of this complex remains today, only fragments. But again, I'd like to draw the parallel between remains of Hopewell houses. The Hopewell was a culture that coexisted with the Adena people beginning about 500 BC and continuing on until 500 AD. And at that time, they died out for whatever reasons. It's not really terribly well known. But once again, I believe that there is a direct parallel between an example of a Hopewell house and this sequence of forms. It's thought that, like the medicine wheel, this does relate to astronomical orientations. It really has not been terribly well studied. Archaeologists as a profession are generally very cautious about making any rash conclusions. And of course, architects and art historians don't really hesitate to leap in and make rash and possibly unfounded conclusions like I'm making right now. This is an aerial view of the very figure we were just looking at. And in a perverse way, this complex is maintained as a golf course today. You can see it, I hope you can see it right there. And it's really been a golf course since the 1920s. And southern Ohio was really absolutely full of these sites. And they were well documented in the 1840s by a team named Squire and Davis. But they were in farmers' fields, and of course farmers did not really respect these ancient remains. So many of them, or most of them, have disappeared since then. This particular example survives because some far-sighted fellow knew that if it were maintained as a golf course, it would have a long life and would be preserved. These are 2 shots which show you what it's like to experience it. It's really not known terribly well how these great shapes were used. As you might have noticed in the previous plan, the circle inscribes almost 40 square acres. They're quite sure, however, that this was not a village, that it was used for sacred purposes of one kind or another. And they're not really sure about the shapes of Hopewell villages. In fact, archaeology is going on right now to try to ascertain that morphology. We can conclude then that there is a powerful consistency here, that the original house, whatever it may be, in a sense conditioned the responses and all levels of building. It conditions ceremonial architecture, it conditioned the actual settlement. And right now I'm trying to begin to ascertain what we can discover about American architecture in a similar way. And since, of course, we have this European intellectual baggage to deal with in this country, we really have to begin with humanism and Palladio. And this is the Villa Trissino in near Vicenza. And Trissino raised the humanist as, you might say, as the exemplar of civic virtue. The humanist was, in effect, the master of all ancient knowledge. And he was quite clear that the humanist had a role in public society. And Palladio himself carried on this role, became a very distinguished scholar in his own right, and wrote several travelogues to Rome, and was quite conscious of the public obligation for the humanist. This tradition, of course, was carried on in England by Lord Burlington on the left at Chiswick House, and on the right we have Mareworth Castle by Colin Campbell. But my main interest is to get to America. And here, of course, is the University of Virginia. And Thomas Jefferson, in effect, raises humanism to a civic religion. That this is where we really find the parallel. That the University of Virginia, in effect, becomes a kind of initial cosmic house for the nation. That Jefferson was deliberately trying to shape new democratic citizens. And the University of Virginia, in effect, quite consciously symbolizes how, well, in fact, the order or organization of the nation, that is to say, each state would have its individual presence, as these pavilions do, but there would be diversity within the overall order. And of course, you all know your American architectural history very well, I assume, that each of these pavilions is designed in a somewhat different way. But once more, to return to Jefferson's ideology of America, he foresaw Americans living in agrarian circumstances, but at the same time, Jefferson still believed in the power and of the town. And in effect, he raised humanism, as I said, to the civic religion. So the ideals of Greece pervaded throughout society. And just as in the Mayan example, where the most primitive hut is echoed in the most dignified ceremonial religious architecture, we achieve the same parallel here with the Greek Revival house on the left and the State House of Virginia in Richmond on the right. And you could almost say that this is the kind of perfect American moment when society was in fact absolutely unified and integrated almost from top to bottom. That may be too forceful statement, and some of my colleagues may quarrel with that conclusion. This is another example of William Strickland in Philadelphia and a Greek Revival house in Indiana, actually in southern Indiana, in Hamilton County. One might assume that the log cabin would become the kind of primitive hut to be sustained through architectural history in America, but it really is not, per se. Curiously, pioneers did their best to get out of them as quickly as they could afford a house such as the one we see on the right. In contrast to the Jeffersonian ideology, we have Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright launched absolutely virulent criticisms against Greek and Roman thinking and ideology. And Joseph Rickworth talks about how Frank Lloyd Wright came from a utopian transcendentalist background in New England, which was really dedicated to the idea of the primitive hut. One thinks, of course, of Thoreau on Walden Pond. And I want to recite a quotation from Wright about his feelings towards Greek and Roman art and architecture. Quote, "The freedom of the new romance, well, you will not find it in Grecian art or mythology. Find it inside the modern democratic man. What a man does, that is his. His vitality as an individual is his reality in the new romance. His honor, and therefore the basis of creation. As a man is, so he must build. Just as a nation builds, so that nation is." So you see, Wright is proposing a severance, in fact, from our earliest roots as a nation. And it almost amounts to, well, at least from this description, a laissez-faire ideology where men should be free to do what they want on their own plot of land. And notice how Wright really identifies the democratic man primarily with the idea of freedom. There's really no mention of the responsibilities of citizenship in the public realm. And it may be true in varying degrees that you can look at a house and extrapolate a city from a given attitude. And of course, in this house, the attitude is quite clearly aimed towards the land. And it's the house and the land. It's a conversation between the house and the land. It's not a conversation between really the house, the street, or the house in the city. And of course, Wright realized the implications of his own thinking in his own urban thought. And this is, of course, Broadacre City. And all of you are probably familiar with this in one way or another. And Wright, of course, did genuinely tap into one of the stronger impulses in American life. And it becomes, in effect, a prototype of the city that we see today. This is downtown Houston, of course, and you can see direct parallels between the development of the periphery of Houston with Broadacre City. This is, of course, where Transco Tower is and other buildings by Caesar Pelli, people of that ilk. On the left is Levittown, PA, which is, in effect, Broadacre City run wild to an almost absurd density. Want to switch now to another kind of cosmic house that will enter into this American narrative. Can we get better focus on the right slide? If that's possible. Is that better? I guess it is. This is an early house by Peter Eisenman called the Falk House in Vermont. And just as I was talking about trying to extrapolate the outer meanings or motivations of a house, you try in this house, and it seems to become a totally internalized game. The house doesn't seem to be making any apparent relationships with anything outside of itself. It almost becomes an architect playing chess with himself within manipulating this 9-square grid in various planes. I don't, however, want to dismiss what has become known as deconstruction. I, in fact, believe that it does have some value in urbanism. This is the Wexner Center in Columbus, Ohio. And some of you may have visited it, but it does demonstrate a kind of deconstructivism which is reaching out and trying to make references beyond itself. And you see this great pergola which slices through the building. It's in fact aligned with the flight path of the airplanes landing at Columbus International Airport. You may not consider that necessarily a cosmic alignment, but I have to give Eisenman credit. It is a genuine attempt to relate with something outside of the actual building. And Eisenman may attribute more importance to air travel than we think. I don't really know. The masonry that we see on the left is actually a reconstruction of an original building on this site. And I want to return again to Broadacre City, which, as it's realized in the modern day, becomes, in effect, fraught with chaotic relationships. And deconstruction becomes a useful analytic tool that could be very useful, in effect, knitting together the broken meanings in the modern city. This is an example, of course, where the architects are beginning with the idea of the city and, in fact, trying to extrapolate the house which belongs in the city. This is, of course, Seaside in Florida by Andres Duaney and Elizabeth Plotter Zyberg. The actual houses we're looking at, I believe, is by Orrin Taylor, and this is called the Dreamsicle House for whatever reason. But I have to say that one does sense a great deal of artifice in this kind of planning. It runs the danger of appearing like Disneyland, but I understand they are making generous efforts to make it real. They're allowing some buildings apparently to be designed in a modern mode. But by and large, for all houses on the site, there is very careful urban design guidelines. And in a sense, in an extremely remote way, they are attempting to restore a sense of what I spoke of before as the civic religion and a certain kind of humanism. There is, of course, the front porch here, which becomes an absolutely general rule in all of Seaside, and a very kind of minimal, somewhat impoverished construction that is not in any way ostentatious. So the individual is left with somewhat limited means to express himself or herself. In conclusion, I just want to say that we as architects have the problem to in effect, derive some kind of new cosmic house for our era. The Duaney Plotter Zyberg efforts do make certain suggestions, but we might return to these earlier examples that we saw and saw how Pueblo Bonito does include certain vestiges of earlier sacred forms in what amounts to a megastructure. That is to say, it's both progressive and archaic at the same time. And on the right, with the Yakut Indians, you see a certain structure which accommodates the individual family, the identity or presence of the individual family within a larger structure. Thank you very much. I can't pretend to be an expert on cosmology or Native American architecture, so I hesitate to entertain any questions, but if anyone is bold enough to pose one, I'd be glad to try to tackle it. Go ahead.
Are you familiar with Pakistan?
No, I'm not. Does that have some bearing on what I'm talking about? I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry. Well, on one hand, I said with the first slide that to be aware of how archaic forms can be included in more progressive ideas. The other slide was of the Yakut Indians, and it was illustrating how the individual or family can be represented within a larger structure. Good. Good. Go ahead.
organization promote kind of project that in some way is totally aware or system that the landscape is offering in terms of those historical precedents. And I congratulate you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Go ahead. Me too. Mm-hmm. Well, it's very difficult to say. What I was trying to argue is that, in a sense, our cosmology is within the realm of learning to some extent, that it began within the realm of learning. Frank Lloyd Wright tried to, in effect, in a sense, propose an organic cosmology. It's a very, I haven't fully resolved this either, but it's in a sense trying to an architecture which speaks of a publicly responsible person. Native American architecture was shaping cultural ways and in effect serving a didactic purpose. And I was trying to, in effect, point out the didactic examples, which becomes our cosmic house in certain respects. I know it wasn't quite clear, and I should have emphasized that more.
Thank you very much for a stimulating lecture. There's one opportunity, of course. This time, our guest lecturer is sort of captive for pursuing, I think, answers to, I think, some very stimulating questions which were raised already and might be pursued later. So many thanks again.